Professor Sol, did you watch the movie The Battleship Island?
The Battleship Island? Yes, I watched it. Seeing how Koreans suffered a lot through the period of Japanese colonialism really depressed me.
Indeed. The Japanese colonial rule over Korea lasted 36 years. For the Korean people, this was a history of much suffering and tragedy. Today, let's learn about this dark period during the last century. Hello and welcome to the third history class for the Introduction to Korean Studies course. I am Huang Yongyuan. Every year's August 15th is a special day for South Koreans. This day is a Korean national holiday, Gwangbokjeol. This day commemorates two important dates: August 15th, 1945, when the Korean Peninsula was liberated from Japanese occupation, and August 15th, 1948, when the Republic of Korea was founded. In August 1910, the Korean Empire was annexed by Japan, starting the peninsula's 36 years of Japanese colonial rule. Today, let's recount the story of Korea's indomitable resistance to Japanese occupation, the struggle for national liberation, and the torturous journey to build an independent country after liberation. Japan's colonial occupation of Korea went through three stages: discretionary policies, cultural policies, and subjugating to the Japanese Empire. The heavy repression period started in 1910, the year when Korea was annexed by Japan, and ended with the March 1st movement in 1919. During this period, the Japanese relied on state apparatus, including the Japanese army, military police, and prisons to impose a reign of terror, prohibiting the freedoms of speech, association, and assembly of Koreans to consolidate their colonial rule. On March 1st, 1919, large pro-independence demonstrations began in Korea in what became known as the March 1st movement. This movement made the Japanese colonial authorities understand that the already 10 years of colonial occupation wasn't enough to suppress the Korean spirit. For this reason, Japanese authorities changed their tactics, shifting to a campaign of cultural repression, employing softer, more coercive measures to win over the Korean people to Japanese rule. The first step was to expand the number of elementary schools in Korea and to allow Koreans to attend Japanese schools. Then, Korean language newspapers were permitted to circulate, and restrictions on gatherings were relaxed, giving Koreans more freedom of expression. Among the three most famous newspapers in today's Korea, Donga-ilbo, East Asian Daily, and Chosun-ilbo, Chosun Daily, were first published in this period. At the same time, government official and clerical jobs in Japanese-controlled Korea, which were previously only given to Japanese, became available to Koreans. Restrictions on Korean investments in factories were also relaxed. In addition, the colonial authorities converted the military police into an ordinary police force to ease tensions. During this period, colonial authorities promoted assimilation with Japan, creating the illusion that Koreans could be treated equally to their colonizers. The Japanese took particular effort in persuading various groups in the upper classes, including the Yambang, aristocrats, Confucian scholars, the wealthy, industrialists, educators, and religious figures. The aim was to turn the upper classes pro-Japanese, ultimately creating divisions and hindering unity in any independence movement. The colonial Japanese also ravished Korea's natural resources. For example, with establishing modern land ownership as a pretext, the colonial authorities' Korean Cadastral Survey 1910 to 1918 sees vast stretches of the Korean countryside, only to transfer it at a low price to the Oriental Development Company, which was an arm of the Japanese colonial administration. In another example, the Japanese colonial authorities implemented the increased rice production plan in Korea, which on the surface helped to increase rice production through the development of superior rice varieties and the expansion of water conservancy facilities. However, the main goal of the project was actually to alleviate an ongoing food crisis in Japan, with increased production sent there. The Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 marked the start of Japan's full-scale invasion of China. Later in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, sparking war with the United States. The Japanese army also invaded and occupied the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia. To support this large-scale war, Japan established the National Mobilization Law in 1938, both in Japan and in its colonies. This included Korea. The law had several clauses that seized government control over civilian organizations, including several strategic industries. This also created price controls and rationing. The law provided the Japanese government the authority to use unlimited means to subsidize the war production. Under this mobilization regime, Korea became a military logistics base that supplied war materials. Japan established in Korea munitions factories that produced metals, machinery, and chemicals. They also increased mining operations in Korea. The law provided the Japanese government the authority to use unlimited means to subsidize war production. In addition, in the name of supplying the Japanese Empire, the colonial authorities also started a campaign of compulsory requisition and seizure of food and other materials in Korea. Towards the end of World War II, the colonial authorities even forcibly confiscated scrap iron, brass utensils, tableware, and nails from households to produce weapons. In addition to plundering these resources and raw materials, Japan also forcibly conscripted Koreans, sending them off to work in mines and factories. Japan aggressively recruited volunteers, students, and various other conscripts, ultimately sending many young Korean men to fight on the front lines of war. The effort of mobilizing people wasn't limited to men. Women were also included in these measures. The colonial authorities forcibly conscripted women in the name of patriotic and volunteer labor corps, exploiting them as a body of forced labor. What was even worse was that many women also became what the Japanese called yanfu, or comfort women. These women had to accompany the Japanese troops wherever they were stationed, suffering tragic sexual exploitation in the process. To make sure that Koreans cooperate with this mobilization of manpower materials, the Japanese colonial authorities also implemented spiritual mobilization measures. For example, they preached Nissendo Soron, the theory of Japanese and Korean ancestral homogeneity, and Neison Iche, a slogan meaning Korea and Japan are one. And they implemented a colonial policy of Japanization to confuse the Korean national identity. The authorities persuaded the Koreans that by serving the Japanese Empire, they would gain the same national status and treatment as Japanese. For this reason, the colonial government banned education and research of the Korean language and history and suspended circulation of Korean newspapers. At the same time, the Japanese authorities implemented Soshikaime, forcing Koreans to use Japanese-style surnames. They also built Japanese shrines in various places and forced Koreans to worship at them. To spiritually enslave Korean children, the Japanese required them to recite the oath of subjects of the imperial nation. This is what happened during the 36 years of Japanese colonial rule. Despite facing harsh Japanese colonial occupation, the Korean spirit never fully yielded to the Japanese colonizers. After Japan annexed Korea, many Koreans fled in exile to northeast China, the Russian Far East, North America, and Hawaii. Soon after the March 1st movement in 1919, the independence movement forces established a provisional government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai, China, and through various diplomatic and public opinion activities, they asked the international community to support Korean independence. The independence movement forces in northeast China and the Russian Far East also established armed bases, trained independent troops, and used guerrilla warfare tactics to fight the Japanese in the Korean borderlands and from within Korea. In addition, there were also secret associations, such as the Korean Patriots Corps, led by Kim Gu, and the Heroic Corps, led by Kim Won-bon. They bombed the buildings where the Japanese colonial authorities were located and assassinated key Japanese officials to resist Japanese colonial rule, demonstrating the will of the Korean people to pursue independence. For example, Yoon Bong-gil, born in 1908 and died in 1932, a member of the Hanin Aigukdan, threw a bomb at the memorial ceremony of the Japanese occupation of Shanghai held in Hongkou Park on April 29, 1932. The bomb killed Yoshinori Shiwagawa, the commander-in-general of the Shanghai Occupation Army, and wounded Mamoru Shigemitsu, the Japanese envoy in Shanghai. This was the Hongkou Park incident that shocked both Korea and foreign countries. Yoon Bong-gil's move gave huge encouragement to the Chinese, who were weary of imminent Japanese aggression. The event also became an important turning point for the Chinese Kuomintang's government's foreign policy, which came to actively support Korean independence. However, the ideological differences between the Korean political left and right split the Korean independence movement into factions, with both sides in frequent conflicts with the other. In the 1930s and 40s, when the Chinese War of Resistance against Japanese aggression was at its height, the Korean left formed in 1942 the Korean Volunteer Army and joined forces with the Chinese Communist Party to fight Japan, whereas the right formed the Korean Liberation Army in 1940 with the support of the Chinese Kuomintang, and fought alongside the KMT and the British Army. As the left and right took different sides, their antagonism foreshadowed the North-South division of the Korean Peninsula after Japan's defeat. In addition, in Korea, several movements demonstrated the will and determination of the Korean nation to strive against colonial rule and for independence and liberation. The March 1st movement in 1919, the June 10th movement in 1926, and the Gwonju student movement in 1929. Many heroic figures were involved in these movements. For example, during the March 1st movement in 1919, Yu Kwan-sun, a 17-year-old girl who was only in Year 1 at Ilhwa Women's High School, returned from Seoul to her hometown of Cheonan after the movement broke out in Seoul. She led the local demonstrations in Cheonan. The result was that her parents were killed by the Japanese police, and she suffered tremendously in prison. When the presiding judge asked her to swear that she would no longer participate in the independence movement, she rejected the notion. In the end, Yoon Kwan-sun died after being continuously tortured in prison. She wrote in her posthumous poem, "The only thing that I can dedicate to the country is my life, and that is my only pain." Such indomitable determination encouraged the Korean Peninsula to continue to struggle through 36 years of colonial rule to welcome the spring of liberation in the end. In August 1945, Japan was defeated and surrendered, and the Korean peninsula was liberated. However, liberation also marked the beginning of much division on the Korean peninsula. The US-Soviet Cold War, ideological opposition, as well as the competing interests of the political factions of the North and South of Korea eventually caused the Korean peninsula to split in 1948. The Republic of Korea, South Korea, was founded on August 15th, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, was founded on September 9th. This division was in part a result of the divisions created under Japanese colonial rule, but it was also fed by both the Cold War and Korea's internal political conflicts. After the North and South split, the two sides, operating under different systems of government, began to compete, and the competition escalated to bloody conflict, with the Korean War breaking out in June 1950. Intervention by the United States and other major world powers further deepened the opposition between the North and the South, which still persists to this day. The division and antagonism of the Korean peninsula pose a severe threat to the stability and development of the two Korean nations and Northeast Asia in general. Promoting North-South peace dialogues, achieving reconciliation and coexistence, and exploring peaceful reunification will remain important agenda into the future. Okay, that ends today's course. How do you like this story? Do you have more of a sense for the deep-rooted longing that Korean people have for freedom and peace? In the next class, Professor So will discuss Korean spirituality, philosophy, and mythology. Goodbye.
Goodbye.